Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to dive right in because we've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover. Today, we're basically going to act as master architects. But, instead of pouring concrete or erecting steel beams, we're looking at the invisible architecture of your business. We are going to figure out if your organization's structural blueprint is actually built to win, or if, frankly, it's bound to just collapse under its own weight. Okay, so we have to start by laying our foundation with Alfred Chandler's absolute golden rule. He famously stated that structure follows strategy. What this actually means for us in the real world is that the way you build your company, your divisions, reporting lines, departments, it must directly support your ultimate strategic goals. Think about it. You don't build a house and then decide you wanted a submarine, right? The strategic goal completely dictates the shape of the vessel. And look, let's just dismantle the myth of the pure structural type right now. Purely functional or purely matrix structures, they're mostly theoretical. They exist in textbooks. In reality, successful organizations rarely adopt a strict by-the-book model. Instead, your organizational choice depends entirely on the specific strategic challenges your company is facing. That means modern structures are almost always custom, tailor-made blends. Organizations mix and match different types to face their own highly unique real-world challenges. But, of course, this brings up a massive problem. How on earth do you know if your unique, custom-blended architecture is actually going to hold up? To answer this, researchers Gould and Campbell developed exactly 9 rigorous design tests. Think of these tests as a strict inspection checklist to stress test your specific tailor-made structural solutions way before you ever actually implement them. To make this easy to digest, we're going to group these 9 crucial design tests into 2 major inspection phases: strategy and fit, people and feasibility, then principles and links, hierarchy and flexibility, and lastly, the final match. All right, let's jump right into phase 1, strategy and fit. This first inspection phase tests the fundamental alignment between your structure and your key objectives. We're looking at 4 specific tests here: market advantage, parenting advantage, people, and feasibility. These 4 ensure your scaffolding is firmly anchored in the harsh reality of your market and your actual resources. Let's break them down. Test number 1 is the market advantage test. This is fundamental, and it links right back to Chandler's rule that structure follows strategy. It simply asks, does your structure actively coordinate your market advantage? For example, if tightly coordinating 2 distinct steps in a production process is exactly what gives you an edge over your competitors, well then those 2 steps should probably be placed in the exact same structural unit. You absolutely don't want organizational silos separating the very things that make you win. Test 2 is the parenting advantage test. This one looks specifically at the corporate center, the headquarters. Your structural design has to fit the parenting role HQ actually intends to play. So if the corporate center's main goal is to add value by acting as a synergy manager across different divisions, then it has to design a structure that places integrative specialisms like marketing or R&D right at the center where they can effectively influence everyone. Still in our first phase, we move on to people and feasibility. Now we look at the human load-bearing walls. The people test is a massive reality check. Do you actually have the managers for this structure? Switching completely from, say, a functional structure to a multi-divisional structure is incredibly dangerous if your organization lacks managers who actually have the competence and experience to run decentralized independent units. Honestly, a brilliant blueprint is completely useless if your builders can't read it. Then there's the feasibility test. This is a vital catch-all category. It basically says the structure has to fit legal, stakeholder, trade union, or similar real-world constraints. Think about the financial sector for a second. After some massive scandals involving biased research, investment banks were literally forced by financial regulators to structurally and physically separate their research and analysis departments from their deal-making departments. Long story short, your structure has to be legal and feasible. Okay, moving on to phase 2, principles and links. Now we step inside the building to test your internal framework against general design principles. These final 5 tests, specialized cultures, difficult links, redundant hierarchy, accountability, and flexibility, they're here to ensure your framework won't just buckle under day-to-day operational pressure. Let's start with the specialized cultures test. This test reflects the immense value of bringing specialists together so they can develop their expertise in close collaboration. A structure automatically fails if it breaks up important specialist cultures and scatters them so far apart that they can no longer innovate or share their unique knowledge effectively. Next up is the difficult links test. This one asks whether a proposed structure will set up links between parts of the organization that are important, but are basically bound to be strained. For instance, extreme decentralization to profit-accountable business units is almost always going to strain relationships with a central R&D department. Unless you put specific compensating mechanisms in place, this kind of strained structural link is highly likely to fail.
Continuing with Phase 2, we inspect hierarchy and flexibility.
Here we inspect the sheer weight of your corporate building. The redundant hierarchy test checks for management bloat. You've got to check if your design has simply too many layers of management. Management bloat causes undue blockages in communication, and frankly, it burns unnecessary cash. Delayering, or flattening the organization in response to redundant hierarchies, has been one of the most important structural trends in recent years for exactly this reason. Then we have the accountability test. This stresses the absolute necessity of clear lines of accountability to ensure the control and commitment of managers throughout the structure. If nobody knows who their boss is, nothing gets done. This is exactly why matrix structures are so frequently criticized for lacking clear accountability. Their famous dual reporting lines can very easily blur who is ultimately responsible for what. Finally, we hit the flexibility test. In a fast-moving world, an important test is the extent to which a design will actually allow for change in the future. For instance, divisional domains should be specified broad enough to let divisional managers pivot and chase emerging opportunities without having to petition the board to rewrite the entire organizational blueprint. Basically, your structure needs to bend, not break.
And that brings us to the final match.
Passing all 9 of Gould and Campbell's design tests is a huge, rigorous achievement, but we're not quite done. Even if your structural design looks totally perfect on paper, it still needs to be matched to the other strands of your organization's configuration. Your internal processes, your daily operations, and your human relationships must all actively reinforce each other for the new configuration to actually hold. If the structure dictates one thing, but the daily processes incentivize something else, the whole building is eventually going to come down. Which brings us to our final vital takeaway. I want you to take the insights from this explainer, sit down with your leadership team, and ask yourselves this. Is your organization's structure actively built to coordinate your market advantage? Does it pass all 9 tests? Ultimately, is your structure built to win, or is it just built? We're diving straight into a really fascinating look at how businesses structure themselves for success, and crucially, how they actually execute their visions. You know, when you look at a massive corporation, you aren't just looking at a single giant entity. No, you're actually looking at a carefully constructed portfolio of completely distinct businesses. So let's decode the structural blueprints that make these complex organizations function and, most importantly, stay competitive. Here's what we're covering today. First, defining the SBU. Second, visualizing SBU structure. Third, the criteria for identifying those SBUs. And finally, strategy formulation versus implementation. Okay, Section 1, defining the SBU, the building blocks. Now, the absolutely crucial point to grasp here is that an SBU, or a strategic business unit, isn't just your standard internal department or some geographical division. No, it's defined by having its very own unique external market. Basically, if a part of an organization is serving a market for goods and services that is fundamentally different from the market served by another part of the company, well, bam, it qualifies as a distinct strategic business unit. So why do we even use them? Well, it's important to remember that an SBU is kind of like an intellectual unit specifically for strategy making. This means your strategy map might actually look a bit different than your literal HR org chart, which is completely fine, because the basis of competitive strategy often differs wildly from one market segment to another. These units allow leaders to tailor strategies for specific markets. It totally avoids that clunky one-size-fits-all approach that just doesn't work in a diverse corporation. Moving right along to Section 2, visualizing SBU structure, the corporate blueprint. Let's take a look at this structure. You can see the Chief Executive Officer sitting right at the very top. Directly below the CEO, the organization branches out into SBU 1, SBU 2, and SBU 3. Remember, each of these represents a completely distinct external market. Then, nested right beneath SBU 1 and SBU 2, we find specific on-the-ground divisions, Division 1, 2, and 3. So, as you can see, an SBU acts as an umbrella. It holds the operational divisions that are actually responsible for executing the strategy in that specific market. But this begs the question, how many SBUs is too many? Think of it like an architect designing a building. You wouldn't just throw up walls where you don't actually need them, right? So we really have to ask ourselves where to draw the line. I mean, it's super tempting for managers to just slice and dice their markets into dozens of highly specific segments. But is that actually helpful for strategy? Honestly, it's a huge balancing act. If managers subdivide markets based on too many differing criteria, identifying compatible competitive strategies becomes a chaotic, tangled mess. The source material explicitly warns us about this. Having too many SBUs can create excessive, unmanageable complexity when you're trying to develop your corporate-level strategy. You literally lose the forest for the trees. The real goal here is to make sensible judgments about which SBUs are actually the most useful for high-level strategy making. All right, Section 3, Criteria for Identifying SBUs. Drawing the right lines. To avoid that chaos we just talked about, organizations generally rely on two distinct framing methods to identify their SBUs, according to researchers Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. Basically, you're either looking outward at the market or you're looking inward at your own capabilities. Let's break down exactly how each of these frameworks operates in the real world. First up, the external market-based criteria. The rule of thumb here is if your target audience, your sales channels, and your competitors are identical, you belong in the same SBU. This holds true even if the internal products seem vastly different. For instance, a unit that offers standardized products globally operates in a completely different reality than a unit tailoring products to highly specific local needs. They face different competitors, they need different strategies, so different SBUs. Similarly, offering the exact same product through entirely different channels, like physical retail stores versus direct-to-consumer internet selling, absolutely warrants separating those operations into distinct SBUs, because the market dynamics are just night and day. Conversely, we have the internal, capabilities-based approach. The idea here is that if producing a premium brand requires entirely different strategic muscles, so to speak, than producing a generic store brand, they belong in separate SBUs, regardless of who is actually buying them. A great example from the text is a food manufacturer. Making high-end, heavily marketed branded goods requires vastly different capabilities. Things like heavy advertising, brand management, premium sourcing. That's a totally different ballgame compared to pumping out high-volume, low-margin retail own brand goods. Even if both of those products end up on the exact same supermarket shelf, sold to the exact same customer, the internal strategic capabilities required are so vastly different that they simply must be managed as separate strategic business units. Now for our final part, Section 4, Strategy Formulation versus Implementation, moving from thinking to doing. So once the architect completes the blueprints, they hand it over to the foreman to actually build the thing. This brilliant breakdown by David reveals exactly how that shift happens. You see, strategy formulation is the highly coordinated domain of just a few architects, aiming to maximize effectiveness. It's an intellectual process, doing the right things before the action even starts. Implementation, on the other hand, is the foreman's operational process. It shifts focus entirely to efficiency, doing things right during the action. And to pull that off, that requires exceptional motivation and leadership skills to coordinate the masses. This brings us to a really profound thought to end on. You can meticulously design the absolute perfect SBU structure. You can formulate an incredibly effective strategy. But if you lack the operational efficiency and the leadership to motivate the masses during implementation, well, that brilliant blueprint just remains a drawing on a page. I really hope this explainer has given you the structural blueprint to evaluate your own organization.
We're taking a journey through what I like to call the ultimate architectural rebuild for struggling businesses. I mean, think about your own company for a second. Are there processes so tangled, so frustrating that you just kind of want to take a sledgehammer to them and start over? Well, if you're nodding your head, you're absolutely in the right mindset for our topic today. We aren't talking about minor tweaks here. No gentle adjustments or, slight pivots. We're talking about a complete, ground-up reimagining of how a company fundamentally operates. So grab your hard hats because we're about to explore the blueprint of radical business redesign. Right off the bat, let's clarify what business process reengineering, or BPR, actually is. And the absolute key word here is radical. BPR isn't just a type of organizational structure. It's a massive, aggressive turnaround strategy. See, back in the 1990s, there was this massive surge of interest in BPR when companies finally realized that redesigning their operational processes could lead to these incredible efficiency gains. When an organization is bleeding money or just totally losing its competitive edge, BPR is the emergency surgery you use to aggressively cut costs and force a return to profitability. It's really not about making a broken process 10% better. It's about discarding that broken process entirely. To understand just how extreme this is, listen to this definition from 1993 by Michael Hammer and James Champy. They basically kickstarted this whole movement. They called it the fundamental rethinking and radical redesign of business processes to achieve dramatic improvements in critical contemporary measures of performance such as cost, quality, service, and speed. Notice the language they're using there: fundamental rethinking, radical redesign, dramatic improvements. They definitely aren't mincing words. They're telling us flat out that the goal isn't to take small, incremental steps. The goal is a paradigm shift. We're targeting cost, quality, service, and speed all at the exact same time. So naturally, that brings us to the big question. Why? Why undertake such a radical re-engineering of your business? I mean, tearing your operational processes down to the studs is risky, right? It's incredibly disruptive. So what exactly are the existential threats that actually force an organization's hand to take on something this massive? Well, there are really three main triggers. Organizations usually find themselves in one of these three distinct buckets. First, and probably the most common, is deep trouble. The company is already failing to sustain itself. You're seeing high product failure rates, or just this non-stop wave of repetitive customer complaints causing huge disruptions. The second trigger is imminent problems. You might not be drowning today, but management can clearly see a waterfall up ahead because of dramatic changes in the internal or external environment. And finally, the third trigger is proactive improvement. This one's for the visionaries. It's when a company actively decides they want to cement a way better position than they're currently in, basically positioning themselves for the future by operating at a level previously thought impossible. Now, when companies face those triggers and they suddenly get access to fancy new information technology, there's this huge temptation to just automate their existing processes. But think about that for a second. If your current process is complex and fundamentally flawed, automating it literally just means you're doing the wrong things faster. There's no point in putting a digital Band-Aid on a broken system. The real key to BPR is detaching from the way a process is currently organized. You have to divorce yourself from the, well, that's how we've always done it mentality.
To really drive that point home, there's this brilliant insight from Patetz in 2003. He said to begin with one simple question. If we were starting afresh, how would we design this process? That right there is the true blank slate psychological shift you need for successful BPR. You can't look at the current org chart. You have to pretend your company was born today, right now, and design the absolute most efficient path from A to Z. It takes a lot of intellectual courage to look at your daily workflow and honestly ask, if I started over today, would I actually build it this way?
All right, let's open up the playbook. Here are Hammer and Champy's characteristics of BPR. The very first rule of the playbook is a big one. Combine several jobs into one. Look, traditional production and commercial processes involve incredibly complex interactions among dozens of people, and they just kind of evolve over time with almost no conscious direction. So you end up with a process where a single document gets handed off to 5 different people in 5 different departments, just for one approval. BPR says no way. Consolidate. Combine those fragmented tasks into a single job to instantly streamline the workflow and kill all that waiting time. Next up, allow workers to make decisions. This is all about empowerment. In traditional, heavy bureaucracies, workers just do the manual tasks and managers make every single decision. But that creates massive bottlenecks. BPR totally flips that dynamic. By allowing the workers who are actually doing the work to make the decisions, the steps of a process can be performed in a natural, logical order. You don't have to hit pause on the entire assembly line just to wait for a supervisor to sign a piece of paper. Then we have flexibility in process design. A lot of businesses love rigid standard operating procedures, one single way of doing things, no matter what the context is. BPR recognizes that multiple versions of processes actually have to exist. You design them to handle different situations efficiently, and you perform processes where it makes the most economic sense. The classic example here is great. Say the accounting department needs a box of pencils. In a rigid corporate setup, they'd have to fill out a form, send it to purchasing, wait for approval, wait for the vendor. It's a nightmare. BPR looks at that and says, wait, for a tiny order of pencils, it's way cheaper to just let accounting walk down the block and buy them directly from the local store. Flexibility just cuts out the nonsense. Now let's group a few logistical rules together to see how we ruthlessly cut bureaucratic fat. First, reduce checks and controls. You should literally only use them when they make economic sense. Second, minimize reconciliation. Stop having departments constantly cross-checking each other's math if the cost of the checking is actually higher than the cost of an occasional error. And third, appoint a case manager. When a complex process does require an interface between different parts of the business, give the customer a single point of contact. It totally eliminates confusion.
Which brings us to this fascinating paradox that BPR manages to solve, reconciling centralized coordination with decentralized decisions. How can you possibly have both? Well, the secret sauce is modern information technology. By using a shared database, local workers out in the field can make rapid, decentralized decisions tailored to their specific situations. But because all of that data is instantly fed into the shared database, upper management still gets perfect overall central coordination simply through that automated information sharing. You get the speed of decentralization with the control of centralization. It's fantastic.
So, what happens when you successfully combine jobs, empower your workers, create flexible processes, and leverage those shared databases? You get the payoff. And the payoff of a successful BPR execution is absolutely monumental. We're talking about major systemic gains in efficiency, quality, and speed. You haven't just optimized the old way of doing things. You have invented a completely new, vastly superior way of operating. You've basically detached from the past and built the future. So that leaves us with one final thought. It's one thing to understand all this theory, right? It's another entirely to see it executed. In our next explainer, we're going to dive into a real-world case study to reveal what it actually looks like when the paperwork hits the shredder and a massive re-engineering begins.